everybody to this ITIF lunch on wireless innovation and spectrum policy. It's obviously a very timely issue given the state of legislation and what's going on today in the administration. I'm Rob Atkinson, President of ITIF. I'm just going to quickly introduce our panelists and speakers today and really turn the panel over to Richard Bennett, who's a senior fellow at ITIF. Moderate the event. So I think when we think about wireless, we're really at perhaps where we were in 2000 with regard to the internet, where it's just kind of really in many ways emerging. And we see that all the time. And I don't know if anybody saw today's article in USA Today in the money section. Real world apps give new meaning, and the augmented reality show, I guess that's some kind of value. It's talking about how mobile apps are going to be able to use augmented reality for a whole layer of information about where you are on devices that you're interacting with. So lots of amazing innovation potentially ready to come, but one of the key things that they depend upon is having adequate spectrum, and that's really the key sort of limiting factor in a lot of these today. So we're going to hear from our two leading engineers to lay out one of the technology issues and opportunities today, and then Richard Bennett will moderate a discussion with our panelists. So we start with Rasiti Abasenge, who is the Director of Network Solutions at Allocation. Dr. Abasenge was joining Bell Labs after completing his PhD in Industrial Engineering from Northwestern University. I'm going to really skip through a lot of these bios. I think you have them. He joined the wireless group at the advent of 3G. He's been involved in 3G, IMS, 4G, LTE, and currently his team has worked on a wide variety of solutions, including fixed, mobile, convergence, next generation networks for voice, carrier Ethernet, et cetera, et cetera. Next is Steve Crowley. Steve is a consulting engineer with his own firm. He has a long background in wireless engineering, including over 20 years of experience with over 400 projects on 4G, 3G, unlicensed satellite, public safety spectrum, machine-to-machine communications, cognitive radio, and a whole set of other areas. He has a master's degree in business from Duke University and is also the co-inventor of several patented wireless communications technologies. Richard Bennett is going to be leading the conversation. Richard is a senior fellow at ITIF and focuses on the broadband and wireless spectrum issues at ITIF. He also is an engineer, has a long background, 30-year background in network engineering and standards. He was vice chair of the IEEE 802.3 task group and multiple other areas. He's having work underwritten by DARPA and other groups. Matt Hussey is the legislative assistant for Senator Olympia Snow, and he's actually he's a real engineer and a policy person. So we'll keep our 2 or 3 engineers honest in terms of what they say. Matt does telecom, commerce, science, and education issues for Senator Snow, and in particular is focused on telecommunications issues, and is really one of the Senate's leading experts on a lot of these wireless and broadband network issues. And I will introduce Nita, who is joining us shortly. Nita Benoit is the senior policy advisor for Senator Mark Warner. And in that capacity, she helps Senator Warner with telecom technology competitiveness and trade issues, and is currently working on the spectrum policy issues for the Senator. And now we'll go from engineers to policy to economists. So this is not in any order of rank and importance. But Al Singer is the managing director and principal of Navigant Economics, and is also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business. And Hal has a long background of looking at the economics of broadband and wireless. He's written a number of books and is a frequent speaker and has editorials in places like the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and he has a PhD in economics from Johns Hopkins. You missed your intro. Hazlitt, who is the professor of law and economics at George Mason University and really one of the leading thinkers on prospective policy from an economics perspective. He is the director of the Information Economy Project at GMU, previously taught at UC Davis, and has written extensively in both peer-reviewed journals as well as popular publications like The Economist and the Wall Street Journal on communications issues. And way back when, in the early 90s, he was the chief economist at the Federal Communications Commission. So I think with that, Rafika, you're going to kick it off.
Thank you, Robert. First of all, I want to thank the ITIF for inviting us to participate here. It's an important event for us. And hopefully you'll see many sides of the argument here. So what I'm going to talk about is what we see in terms of the need for capacity in wireless networks. So about 10 years ago, when wireless data first started becoming available to consumers, my colleagues in Europe used to laugh. They were texting, they were doing web browsing using WAP, they were downloading ringtones, and all we did was talk. But today, it's a different world. Today we're in a world of smartphones, of tablets, of apps, of YouTube, and if you think about it, the top smartphone operating systems are the Apple iPhone operating system and the Android operating system, both of which are based in the United States. The top applications are applications like Facebook, Twitter, also based in the United States. The largest LTE, the largest 4G LTE deployments in the world are happening today here in the United States. Verizon Wireless and Metro PCS already have networks up and running, and very soon AT&T will. And some of the most important innovations in wireless, including this product here, which we call Light Radio, are coming from companies like Bell Labs, at which I work, and which is also, though it's global, is based in the United States. So from a wireless broadband perspective, to me, from a global perspective, this is our Apollo moment. Right? The whole world is looking at us, to the United States, and looking at us in terms of leading the world in wireless broadband. I host customers in New Jersey almost every other week from all over the world. What they want to know is, well, what are we doing to make wireless data successful, and how can they follow? So, what's the problem here? Well, the problem is that we essentially unleashed this beast of wireless data demand here in the United States. And it turns out that we as consumers and also as working people really love wireless data. And we've been observing wireless data traffic in our customers' networks, in some of the products we have in their networks, to make sure that they stay on top of providing the right capacity and the right quality of service to their customers. And we have seen over the past few years how wireless data consumption has grown in the network. And especially over the past year or so, what we've seen is that these new devices, these new smartphones, or we even call them superphones, are really driving enormous amounts of data into the network. And now we have even new categories of devices, like tablets, which are wireless enabled, and which also consume even more, probably about 3 to 4 times as much data than the smartphones. So again, it sounds like a good problem to have, right? You have a demand for services that wireless operators are providing, and we as infrastructure manufacturers can satisfy that demand. Well, the problem is twofold. One is of physics, and one is of economics. So it turns out that there's a limit to the amount of data you can squeeze into a given bandwidth. So a given bandwidth here is the amount of spectrum that's available to wireless operators. So we're essentially running out of space on this existing wireless infrastructure to drive, to send all of this traffic. And this limit is basic physics. Basically, there's a limit of amount that you can compress this data into a given bandwidth. And what happens is, to get around this, wireless operators put what they call spectrum reuse. So essentially, they build smaller and smaller cells, smaller and smaller sectors, to cover less and less people to satisfy the demand for wireless capacity. Now, after a point, this becomes too expensive. And for wireless service providers, this is a disincentive to provide capacity that is needed to satisfy the demand. So if you sit back here when we're watching on top of the world in a Apollo moment and look ahead to the future, what we see is the ability to provide services like productivity enhancing services like video conferencing to enterprises, the ability to save lives with healthcare monitoring type services, also the ability to improve people's experiences through sharing remote moments. For example, grandparents will share in their grandchildren's moments even though they're far apart using video communications. And also, of course, you still need to satisfy the demand for watching YouTube. So going into the future, what we really need to be able to do is to widen this, this highway that we've built so far for wireless data, make it a true superhighway. So really what we see, we look at demand, and we look at demand based on the existing traffic that we see in the network, and based on the user behavior, we see this demand growing 30 times over the next 5 years or so. And there really is no technology that is going to improve 30 times this time frame. So we really need new spectrum.
Thanks also to the ITIF for this invitation and the important work it does in promoting technology policy discussions. I'm going to talk about two things. One is forecasts of demand and mobile data growth, some of that. And also some of the technologies and the methods and techniques that operators might use to meet some of that demand. Going to the forecasts, we saw one there in the last presentation. There are several forecasts out there and an increasing number of mobile broadband data growth. I count about 10 so far, and I normalize them to get compound annual growth rate from the year 2010 to 2015. I don't have any slides, by the way, so don't be confused. You can leave it up, that's fine, but I'm just talking. But what growth rates are these 10 different forecasts, and the lowest case forecast I see is predicting a 20% growth rate about over the next few years. The highest forecast is forecasting a 200% growth rate annually over the next few years. So we have a huge spread in forecasts, and really as we go toward more marketplace solutions, that's less important. One thing I point out is the growth rate is in decline. We see these curves that go like this, and it's alarming when you first see them. But if you look year from year, what's happening is the percentage increase is decreasing. So it's growing. The data rates are going up, but the growth rate is decreasing. So we're going up like this, but if the present trend continues, what will happen is we'll go like that, more of an S-curve. We'll see. And even then, it'll be maybe 20, 30, I don't know, maybe based more on other internet trends. From a policy-making standpoint, the issue is we have all these forecasts, and policymakers are not uniform in the forecasts they use to engage in policy-making activities. Like The FCC has a spectrum estimate that published in October 2010. It uses 3 forecasts. One of those forecasts is used to, a worst case forecast to promote the need for more spectrum. There's a lot of forecasts floating around and they've never been vetted or looked at critically, like I think they should be in an open process, and maybe some of the assumptions looked at. If they're going to continue to be used or relied on, perhaps the FCC needs to develop its own spectrum estimate. Maybe like the wireless competition report is updated every year, maybe we need a spectrum estimate updated every year. But just sort of a note of caution that if we rely on this increasingly, these private sector forecasts, maybe justify them or be uniform in our use of them, and maybe look at them a little more critically. Now I'm going to go to the technology part. We've heard of just one very important technology that I think is going to be there in the years ahead to help. We're reaching the limit in what the radio can squeeze through one radio link. This is commonly referred to as the Shannon link. We're in LTE now, and LTE Advanced, I'm going to skip that and go to LTE Advanced, which is the next generation that will be here in about 3, 4, maybe 5 years. An important part of LTE Advanced is heterogeneous networks, where it's not just these large cells, it's the smaller cells that Steve is talking about, but also integrating Wi-Fi and other technologies to offload some of that data. But increasingly, we'll be able to add these cells, even within a larger cell, on the same frequency to address a capacity problem. And that's something that's not really been too practical to now. And it's not so bad. You have about 80% of the traffic on 20% of the cell sites, and so it's not all that large a number of sites that need to be treated. Other techniques, I mentioned Wi-Fi. There's a lot of activity in other countries in this. Software, operating systems, applications can be coded more efficiently. Sectorization, where you take a current or a present antenna that might be divided in 3 sectors and split it up into more for additional capacity. Backhaul, I think that's something to be looked at too. As we go to this cognitive network, we have these many small cells. I think the radio part is under control. So more of a concern to me, not working with backhaul that much, is how we're going to connect all these many small devices. So I look forward to questions later. Thank you.
I see folks in the back. There's at least 1 seat here. There's 4 seats there, 2 seats there. If you want to come on up, feel free. There's no point standing the entire time. Richard. Thank you everybody for coming. So the 3 questions that we want to answer today about spectrum are: how much do we need? Where does it come from? And how do we transfer it from its current use to the use that we want for it? Larry Levin, Larry here? Yeah. Wrote a great column on the Hill last week, making the observation that there's no longer such a thing as spectrum allocation. It's now all spectrum reallocation. It's already been allocated. So one of the things that you get from looking at people discuss the value and forecast for data demand is that, in fact, nobody knows, right? If anybody knew exactly what the demand was going to be for wireless data 5 years in the future and where it was going to come from, then, you know, he could master the stock market. But, you know, predicting the future, which is what forecasting is, well, in the business context, we engineers like to have a specific forecast from marketing people that we build our products based on. And we regard a forecast as an input to the engineering process. Forecast is also, I think, an input to the policy process.
Because, you know, you establish a goal like the National Broadband Plan did with 500 megahertz of total spectrum that needs to be newly released for mobile broadband, fixed wireless, and unlicensed uses. It's a place to start. And so, and once we have a general concept of what that target is for spectrum, and in fact, spectrum is sort of almost a trick question. Because the real issue is how much data capacity do we need for wireless networks. And because the data capacity can obviously be met in two ways. It can be met by additional spectrum and by additional efficiency. And there are limits to both of those factors. So where it comes from is one of the things that's behind the notion of spectrum inventory. And Matthew, you're a member, the snow carry, what's the name of the spectrum inventory bill?
Radio spectrum inventory.
Yeah.
Self-explanatory.
But it has one of those fancy names too, right?
Well, now, we incorporated into the radios act.
Yeah, the radio, yeah. Catchy title.
Yeah. It took me a long time to figure that out.
Yeah. So what's the rationale there?
Well, you know, one of the things is that it kind of brings me to this quote, and I can't remember who said it, but in order to achieve harmony, you have to play different notes. And that's kind of how we have to take this spectrum issue at hand, spectrum reform, is to look at a comprehensive approach that encompasses a lot of different perspectives. And oh, is it on? Is it on now? Testing.
Yeah, it's on.
Is it on now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And I'll just speak loud.
Somebody has to say, can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me now? And so a comprehensive approach that includes reallocation, but also looking at how we can foster greater technical innovation in the space, incentivize greater infrastructure investment, and then also look at having more aggressive spectrum policy and management, so more aggressive spectrum sharing and reuse opportunities. And so taking that comprehensive approach is the only way we'll truly address any looming spectrum crisis or crunch that is currently man-made because of just an archaic management in place. And but one of the first steps though is a comprehensive inventory. It's not going to give us, we'll probably actually have more questions after an inventory than we have going into it, but it will certainly provide us a lot more granular data to build a solid foundation for which to construct comprehensive spectrum policy and management for the 21st century and for all these new evolving technologies. And obviously the center has been very interested in this, having introduced Senator Kerry the Radio Spectrum Inventory Act back in last Congress, back in March of 2009. And even more recently, sending a letter inquiring as to on several different issues, but certainly one of the first issues is regarding the FCC claim that they've done a baseline inventory, and obviously a baseline does not equate to a comprehensive inventory, and just trying to find out what the status of a comprehensive inventory is, because again, that's going to provide us a lot more granular data to build forward, because we can take that data, then delineate it with doing actual real-world spectrum measurements to find usage patterns across the various bands, and also occupancy rates to make sure that the licensee is using the spectrum in the most efficient way. But also then, because we do those measurements, we could then, again, correlate different usage patterns where we could then maybe do assignments on a co-primary or secondary allocation for using spectrum in a band when it's not being used at a certain period of time. So there's a lot of different ways to look at this. And for example, I know one of the big issues, and I'm sure we'll receive some questions about it, is the Rockefeller KVH public safety bill. But one of the things public safety has been talking about is that their desire to basically provide nationwide coverage, building about 50,000 cell sites. And they said, well, we'll probably either, we'll do a combination of building those, green field, utilizing buildings, or co-locating using existing commercial infrastructure by hardware. Well, an inventory will provide greater information on where the existing infrastructure is, so that they can readily access those sites to build the infrastructure necessary. So that's just showing the importance of an inventory as a first step. And as I've said before, my boss doesn't believe that it needs to be a sequential activity to the incentive auction authority, because those are supposed to be voluntary and for a finite number of participants or licensees. But it is really an important step in moving forward, because without an inventory, we're kind of shooting in the dark, so to speak. Because as we've inquired about, if you look at the current interfaces at the FCC, the license view and the spectrum dashboard, those are very good front-end interfaces. But at the same time, if you do a couple clicks, it just directs you to the ULS, the Universal Licensing System database record, which it's anyone's guess how up to date that is or how accurate it is. If you look at some of the contour maps there of where the coverage of the license, it's just a circle, and that's it. It doesn't. There's no detail, even if you expand out. So we just really need to provide more data, and it also help have these discussions. It'll really move forward the debate on what we can do, because again, at the end of the day, we need a comprehensive approach to address this problem.
You made a really interesting point there in terms of the criticism that I hear about spectrum inventory proposals is that people regard it as a delaying tactic, or as sort of if we have to do the comprehensive inventory, actually because we don't have systems in place to do that, it could take years to actually build a system capable of collecting the information at the granular level about, and people have to understand this, the inventory is not what's been allocated, it's how things are actually being used, right? It's the shape of the real networks and the extent of the traffic. So like you said, it's not a sequential process. We don't stop everything, go do an inventory, and then come back in 20 years and we have that and figure out what we need to do about spectrum. This is sort of a parallel track, and I think it's an indication of the fact that for so long, spectrum allocation has been a static process that depends on the wisdom of what I like to call the omniscient regulator, who has the complete knowledge of this unchanging technical landscape and is able to allocate spectrum to the best and highest purpose forever, once and never again. And we're transitioning from that world to a world of more or less continuous reevaluation, reassessment, transfer, reallocation, reuse as new opportunities come up. This slide here, by the way, is this is a system that the TechLog TechCrunch used to conduct live video interviews from the floor at Consumer Electronics Show. And what this backpack is power for a video camera, but it's also wireless transmitters that upload up to the 3 major wireless networks at the same time. So the only way they could get the bandwidth from the show floor at the Consumer Electronics Show was to upload on AT&T, Verizon, and Sprint all at the same time. The Wi-Fi there is essentially useless because there's too many people contending for the 80 megahertz that everybody wants to use in the 2.4 gigahertz frequency band. So they have this system, but you can sort of imagine that if you can do something like that, use all 3 networks at the same time with a backpack-sized piece of gear today, in the near future, you can probably integrate that into something like this. This is IEEE Spectrum's Technology of the Year for 2011. It's called Smart Vision. The eyeglasses are actually VGA displays over both eyes. And in the nose piece of the glasses is a video camera. And you've got power and stuff over the ears. And it uses Bluetooth to communicate with your smartphone. So basically, this is for augmented reality apps. They see what you're seeing and then they project these visual clues. Now, I sort of think that the iPhone 10 from 2020 is going to look a lot like this. Okay, it'll just, the phone functionality will be built into those earpieces, and it'll be a self-contained unit. And if that happens, well, yeah, the demand for mobile data will obviously will be more towards the 300 annual growth rate rather than the 30. And this is the thing from USA Today on mobile augmented reality that just sort of fortunately happened to be in today's paper through no manipulation of my own. Okay, so back to the panel. So the inventory process is going to be more or less continuous, and that's going to be part of the policymaker's toolkit as we move forward. Now, incentive auctions are something that is surprisingly contentious. Now, it seems to me that there shouldn't, it's almost kind of baffling why there should be this so much debate about whether it's reasonable to allow a voluntary divestiture of spectrum for a fee to be split between, you know, the current owner and the government. So, Nita, you can explain your senator has a spectrum auctions bill, and it takes the very permissive approach, right, of allowing the FCC to construct that auction.
Right. So I think for Senator Warner, the availability of multiple means for providing spectrum to both commercial users, unlicensed uses, other federal needs. I think there's a desire on his part to have availability at different points in the timeline. So for Senator Warner, I think having incentive auctions is one way to provide some additional spectrum in the pipeline. And yeah, and I think he would agree that the voluntary nature of it should make it something that people could coalesce around. And I think as a concept, there's not as much disagreement at this point in time. Maybe Matthew has a different opinion, but I think generally in the Senate Commerce Committee that as people feel like it's going to happen, the question is what happens to to folks who are being repacked if they're broadcasters, and then there are some questions about MSS and general operation of that band. And I think the other thing that's important is that it sounds like the MSS auction would be the first one to move, which means that it gives the FCC some time to kind of provide its modeling and to figure out how to best approach incentive auctions for broadcasters, because those will be more complicated. It sounds like it'll be all in one auction, but maybe it'll be multiple auctions, and it just like the way that the process when auctions were first envisioned and developed in the late 80s and 90s, and obviously Senator Warner knows a little bit about that personally, but it took some time for the commission to really get a feel for what they were doing, what was the best way to go, and I think anyone who works in the commission at that period of time probably feels like they got better at it, and they have over time. So I think our hope is that with incentive auction authority, that would be something that would improve over time as well.
Hal Singer, you're one of the gang of 112 economists who signed the famous letter on the incentive auctions. What's your take on it?
Just as a point of correction, I wasn't, but not because I objected, but I think that if 120 eminent economists signed a document, how could all of them be wrong? I do think that they're onto something. It's a hard problem to solve, and they're probably onto the right path. Is what I feel what's going on. I think that auctions are generally a good thing. I think as an economist, I might be a little biased in favor of auctions, but they allow ugly rich people to win things that would otherwise be awarded in a beauty contest to dominated by skinny people. So what's not to like about that? I think that there's a lot of good things that can come of it. First, it removes the potential for corruption that would otherwise be felt in a beauty contest or a comparative hearing. It gets spectrum to the people who value it the most, and it does so very quickly. And it preserves resources that would otherwise be devoted towards lobbying. So I guess I'm a big fan. Well,
isn't there a pitfall in terms of you have a sort of an unsupervised auction, then people, there's fragmentation in the market. People will get little slices of spectrum, and what they need are larger contiguous chunks.
That's certainly a possibility, but I think that this can be planned for in the design of the parcels. I just think that you have to trust that you've got some really sharp people doing this, and that sort of aggregation problem is going to confront any kind of attack, any type of solution to the problem that we're facing. And it seems to me that with the auction design and allowing bidders to put together combinations and to bid on combinations, it's a pretty smart way of going about it.
So Tom Hazel, you were former chief economist at the FCC. Are the folks at the FCC smart enough to put this kind of an auction together?
I'm afraid they are.
Is it going to work?
Compared to what? Well, that's the question, and I was not one of the 112 economists who signed the letter. And I made a note, before attacking Blair Levin, I wanted to say something nice. And it's not gratuitous, but I'm very happy about economic developments and political developments over the last couple of years that have put this push for more licensed spectrum with flexible use, what I call liberal licenses, forward as really the top agenda item in the entire broadband debate, and that's extremely important. I don't like to get into personal stories, but I'm sleeping with Chapter 5 of the National Broadband Plan. I hug it with my blanket every night, and I do credit those efforts. I think it's very important. As I told the folks doing that plan at the time, submitted the record an alternative, putting the FCC into a situation where they have to be really smart and really good is a recipe for disaster. And there are many calls here that are going to be excruciating, okay? And the fact that you're now wondering how to get legislation out of the Congress, in economics that's called the transaction cost. And the argument for going this route, for new statutory authority for the FCC to make lots of delicate calls, including this rather profoundly legislative function of figuring out what a split is going to be in the auction proceeds, which makes me not even understand what the auction is that they're talking about. An auction is where you bid a price and get the price and transact at that price. And so there's going to be some intermediary here that's going to do something different with those bids. It's a very complicated route, and the proof is in the pudding. Rather than come up with a mechanism that could reallocate potentially all the TV band for higher valued uses, 294 megahertz, 49 TV channels, the FCC is trying to get 120 megahertz, and they think they can do that from published reports by simply taking about 120 TV stations off the air, leaving 1,700 TV stations doing basically what TV stations did in 1952, unhindered by the March of Progress. Now, there are huge flaws in that approach, and part of the problem stems up immediately in the fact that most television stations are facing a situation where they gain nothing from the reallocation. They lose something in terms of a reallocation, which is forced at some stage. And of course they're going to want to hold it up. I mean, that's just rent-seeking 101. Of course they're going to want to hold it up. The more liberal mechanism would be to do it, what Richard actually talked about, which would be to put rights in the marketplace that give the correct price signals. And so the real problem is not getting broadcasters off the air. It is not getting broadcasters off the air. It is simply putting rules in place that allow people to move spectrum around and allow the broadcasters to be an enthusiastic part of the solution. And for this idea that the transactions costs in the marketplace prohibit that and the FCC has to come to the rescue, let me just point to a thing called the mobile market. In fact, Larry's correct. There are no more allocations, only reallocations. In fact, that's been the case all through the life of the mobile industry, okay? Cellular license spectrum was reallocated from television. It took, the FCC says it took 11 years. I don't know how they get that. AT&T actually applied for that spectrum in 1958 for cellular, and it got out there expeditiously in 84 to 89 in the lotteries. But these delays are formidable just because you have all this rent-seeking activity that's centered in Washington. And we have experience now with these overlay licenses that actually allow the spectrum reallocation to take place in the market. And the mobile market, the last I counted was in 2003, and I did go on the ULS, Universal Licensing System, and figure out that there at that point were, memory serves, 50,866 CMRS licenses. That's how many licenses were put together, those little scraps, every one of them a holdout problem, every one involving transaction costs to get 4, 5, 6, or 7 national networks. In fact, if Clearwire has a national network, I don't think anybody knows. I don't think Clearwire knows how many thousands of deals, licenses, resale agreements, roll-ups, and everything else they've had to go through to get coverage at 2.5 gigahertz, not to mention FCC reallocations and orders and all that other stuff. So the market can take care of that if you put the right rules in the marketplace. Sure, it could be done better if the FCC had been more liberal and flexible early on, but we are where we are, and the way to get to this quickly is to have overlays issued for the entire TV band, grandfather the TV stations where they are, give them liberal rights, and allow them to partner with the new users of the spectrum. And by the way, I can't honestly say, I mean, I can answer exactly how much more spectrum. I know the title of the question here was, how much more spectrum do we need? I can answer that precisely. The answer is more. But I can't tell you if we reallocate all 290, if we allow all 294 megahertz in the TV band to go to their highest valued use, I can't tell you there's going to be some over-the-air TV broadcasting done. I think at the margin there may be 30 or 50 or 60 megahertz that might be used, probably configured differently than today, quite differently. But nobody knows the answer about the efficiency constraints that would be discovered if we allowed that liberalization. So that's the liberalization I'm in favor of. And I'm trying to call it the Hazlett plan. And if you, I'm assigning trademark to that. If you spread it around, obviously I'll become even more despised by name than
You're so completely loved. There's only one way you can go. We'll put pointers to your papers on the overlay plan up on the events page after the show. Hal, you look like you're coming up your seat.
So I've contemplated the Hazlett plan as the alternative, and I had two questions for Tom, and maybe you can address. But they seem to me the two impediments to the Hazlett plan that you have to overcome to convince the crowd and the world that it's better than the incentive auction. And the first notion is that if all you get from winning this auction, the overlay auction, is the right to negotiate, it seems like it would be very difficult for carriers to go to the capital markets and say, I need this money, and all I'm going to get from the end of it is the right to negotiate. So it seems that the carriers might need a little more certainty than that to execute that business plan. And the second pitfall that I see, or that's too strong, but impediment that I think you'd have to overcome is this notion of the holdup problem. I mean, the holdup problem is something that's well recognized in business literature. The notion being that in a series of negotiations, each individual guy has an incentive to hold out, hoping that he'll be able to shape things and kind of act opportunistically. And I see how the FCC's incentive auction proposal addresses that, but I don't see how the overlay auction proposal addresses that in the sense that suppose Verizon wins the right to negotiate with 10 or 20 broadcasters. What's to stop the 19th broadcaster from engaging in hold-up in that round of negotiations?
I'm very glad you asked me that question. there's no question there are transactions costs. I mean, that's the reason I cite a congressional statute, which is the alternative, is that it's said by FCC staff that they can't possibly have overlays because there are too many transactions costs. Well, we've reallocated lots of spectrum through overlay rights, and we've learned a little bit about that. In general, the overlays work extremely well just straight up. Now, in addition to that, we've had other mechanisms for arbitration between incumbents and entrants. And so if there really is a hold-up problem, then you can go on that's exactly the route you ought to go. You ought not to stop progress. You know, as I said, we've done this before. We cleared out 4,500 microwave users, licensees, in the PCS bands to get PCS spectrum reallocated. And there was a hold-up problem that lasted for several years. It's one of the reasons, maybe the primary reason, we were much later than Europe in getting 2G digital wireless services in the U.S. market, because that spectrum was held up by the claims of the microwave incumbents that could never be reallocated. But here's the point. The economists and the regulators are thinking about this exactly backwards. It's not a situation where Verizon or a new bidder for spectrum will come in and then be befuddled by all the incumbents. Once an overlay auction is announced, first of all, the FCC can do it better than worse. They should have broad overlay rights so that one TV station cannot hold up progress for an entire band that's being auctioned. So that's part of the proposal. But once you announce the auction, instantly there are negotiations between incumbents and entrants, and there are partnerships and alliances, and deals get done quickly. And then when there is an auction, people know with some certainty, probably because they've signed contracts with incumbents and formed partnership deals, how the spectrum can be utilized. Now, the broadcasters, for their part, do want to be part of a solution. There are all kinds of businesses today. They're particularly big in the cable business, if you haven't noticed. Okay, so they love alternative means of distribution for video programming and for other types of businesses that they might want to conduct. They would love to partner with some of these wireless firms. They would love to do equity deals. And these kinds of deals will get done. It's not going to be a situation where all of a sudden you paid X billion dollars for a license and you're surprised that these incumbents are going to hold you up. So as I say, you look at the mobile market today, how did Nextel get to be a network? A $35 billion asset. Okay, that was never allocated by the FCC, and some entrepreneurs who knew FCC rules went out there and pieced together thousands of licenses, all of which have hold-up problems associated with them. And somehow, after they got the reallocation rules done right by the commission, they were able to piece that whole thing together. So this kind of stuff actually is very pro forma for markets. And if you allow the negotiations to go forward, in other words, you have a regime in place so that the rules for spectrum control are such that deals can be done, and you can take spectrum out of one allocation and put it into another, one application into another, then you'll see this stuff fall into place. And to the extent that there are hold-up problems, the FCC should solve the hold-up problem, not hold-up progress.
Can I just add to that? And I think one of the challenges is for the folks who were there for Nextel, I'm not sure that they want to go through that experience again. Having undertaken the complexity of that course, I think there is, to Hal's point, the idea of some kind of clearing process, which, under the current rules for how spectrum has been allocated, it doesn't exist without additional congressional mandate or direction. I think there is a question of what do you do for regional carriers? What do you do for technology companies? What do you do for folks that aren't, aren't the day before to wherever we end up with telecom companies? I mean, there are kind of different uses of that spectrum and different purchasers that might want to enter a market to buy it. And I mean, I think that the overlay idea has some interest, but it seems like it's missing a common framework or set of rules that any potential market participant could use to acquire spectrum if they want to.
Well, is this one of the classic debates between a specific solution for the problem of TV frequencies versus a more general solution that's more comprehensive and probably could take longer to implement? Where incentive auctions, are a point solution to the problem of getting television broadcast frequencies out of the hands of broadcasters who basically aren't using it for much utility, especially in urban areas, where you essentially need to watch TV. Because it goes back to the situation 50 years ago when telephones are all ran on wire and television was all over the air, and now those roles they're not completely reversed, but they're obviously in the course of reversing, and we discovered that we want to do things in different ways.
Okay, I don't think the issue is that no broadcaster is using that spectrum. I mean, I think most people feel like broadcasters are providing a valuable service, and there are different levels of usage within that community. So again, I think the auction is a way to capture people that are willing participants, people who want to cash out, want to do a different business, whatever, as opposed to folks who want to continue to serve in a traditional capacity. There are affiliates and other people who obviously want to stay in that business and see value in it. So I think for someone like Senator Warner, providing everyone those opportunities has a lot of appeal, and that's why I think we feel more comfortable with the process that gives the FCC some discretion here. Because I don't think anyone has an answer on the phone for how this is going to work. I mean, I think there are opinions at the table. I don't think there's a firm answer, because we don't know.
Well, when we look for authoritative answers about spectrum and broadband issues, we turn to Blair Levin. And your ears must be, well, I mean, your name's been taken in vain several times.
Yeah, there's a seat for you. There's a seat for you here, Blair.
A couple of quick things. First of all, Tom, I think your plan would have a better chance if you sell the naming rights. Sure, something like that. No, look, I would say right off that I like Tom's plan better than the alternative, than the status quo. And the status quo basically puts us in a position where we do nothing for 5 years. We actually hit the crisis. The most important highway for commerce in the last half of this decade becomes full of potholes and much more expensive. And then the FCC just basically takes it away from the broadcasters. That's what's going to happen, if you project forward current trends. And why the broadcasters actually, as a political matter, think that's better than the alternatives is an interesting, subject that academics would study. But the point is, Tom and I agree on a lot of things about the importance of having a good spectrum policy. We kind of go 80% of the path down the same way. And then at the very end, we have two very different models. And I think the problem that we had with Tom's plan, which we discussed a lot during the broadband plan, there were a couple of things. There are choices. I think everyone should be clear on the choices. Number one, and I think Nita was talking about this, the way that Nextel put their license together actually took a huge amount of time, a huge amount of transaction costs. It was not a 1-year thing, it was a 10-year thing. And we think in terms of the way global harmonization works and other kinds of developments, it's better if the FCC can do the repacking and do the actual allocation. So that was one thing. The second thing was unlicensed. And I know Tom's very clear that he doesn't believe unlicensed has value. Our group disagreed, and I think there was a consensus at the commission that something needs to be done about unlicensed. You could have an overlay with some remaining unlicensed, but it fundamentally doesn't do that. And the third thing, which was very persuasive with us, was that the logical buyers evidenced to us that they would rather go through, both plans had certain transaction costs, but the buyers, one of them sitting next to me, as we were going through the plan, they basically said, we like the incentive auction plan. We'd rather you guys do that. We think that can get through Congress. It's actually, in my view, it's unfortunate that it's been caught up with the public safety issue because, in fact, it's a very simple idea. No one's against it in principle. We could just run 1 cent bill through to get it done. The buyers, and in this sense, in some sense, represents kind of, from a political economy approach, a market test of whether the Hazlett plan or the broadband plan is the best path toward moving spectrum in a fundamentally efficient reallocation process. I think the broadband plan is better, but having said that, I deeply respect the work that Tom has done, and that is better than the status quo. So if we can't pass an incentive auction plan in the next couple of years, I think the FCC should just go ahead and say, okay, we'll do it this way. And there'll be a number of losers, but at least let's be clear about the trade-offs here.
Can I just quickly say that? First of all, thank you for that suggestion, Blair. I have my computer here, so I went online and I did quickly sell the naming rights. So from now on, we're going to call it the Trump overlay, okay? I'll be leaving and going on vacation after the session here. I'll stay through, but I want to say just a couple of quick things. We do have a serious disagreement about transactions costs, but it's not really disagreement, Blair. My trick ending is that the reason you're only going after 120 megahertz is because you understand what the constraints are within the plan that you put forward. You can't get the 294 that way. 294 is what we ought to be going for right now. And so the overlays do that. By the way, they don't rule out unlicensed. In the proposal I did put to the FCC, you can actually clear nationwide unlicensed, and you can do it through the overlay plan much more simply and quickly with lower transactions costs, as making it a condition attached to one or more of the licenses. There are some rules that we should get right in the overlay to make sure the transactions costs are not extravagant, and the regulators really need to pay attention to those. We're certainly in agreement on those. And I do understand that the plan that's been put forward has left the station. There's certainly progress. I also consider it an improvement on the status quo. And if the, let's call it the Trump plan, is option B, then that's where we are. So I think, like Blair said, we do have concurrence on a lot of this, and that's progress.
Well, if I may mention, I mean, one of the things, again, we need to look at this from a non-traditional sense, or the old school thought of reallocation. Let's keep, doing some arbitrary measurement of what is deemed, efficient use or for the better good. But because we're going to hit a point of diminishing return, a lot of diminishing return is going to hit, because we're going to have to trade mission-critical services for business-critical services. I mean, there's going to be some low-hanging fruit, but when you're talking about taking spectrum away to do, some type of air telemetry or radar, it's going to be much more difficult to ascertain what the true value is, because citizens or consumers are utilizing that either directly or indirectly. I think second of all, whether it's 120 or 290 or however much, if you're looking just at the broadcast, we still fall very, very short of what CTIA has claimed that they're going to need 800 megahertz spectrum in, I guess, a decade, and also what is, again, somewhat dated, but the ITU 2006 study said a mature market, developed market, will need anywhere from, I think, 1,280 megahertz to 1,700 megahertz of spectrum for UMTS. So the incentive auction is not a golden key. It is not going to provide us, a clear path to achieving the future needs. And we also have to remember, the federal side. Talking again about air telemetry and radar. Just to give you an example, there are 80 agencies, federal agencies and departments that use spectrum for 40 different types of radio-based services. So we have to look at this more holistic when we're talking about true spectrum ecosystem. It's not just wholly supported by wireless broadband, but we need to look at how we can meet the future needs, whether it's for radio astronomy, whether it's for weather satellites. I mean, the list goes on. And so, again, we just really have to take a more comprehensive view on how we address this. Because if you look at what, the industry is doing, anyway, I think 65% of global carriers are planning to use femtocells as a major component in their LTE infrastructure. Femtocells are just mini base stations, just like, and also Wi-Fi, unlicensed use. Not 90% of smartphones will be Wi-Fi capable in 2 years. 50% of broadband homes have Wi-Fi routers in it. And 30% of smartphone mobile data traffic has been offloaded onto wireline broadband networks via Wi-Fi. So we have to look at these models and kind of work together to find confluent points of how we can, again, foster greater innovation, do direct allocation, direct reallocation, but also greater incentives of just pushing a lot of these emerging technologies. Because, and last point I'll make, to your point where you're talking about large contiguous bands, LTE, you can have assignments of only 1.4 megahertz. Okay, you can do spectral bandwidth assignments from 1.4, 3, all the way up to 20 megahertz. Now, why is that? Well, because they're looking at emerging technologies, DSA, cognitive radio, spectrum aggregation, which is similar to channel bonding, so where you can complement separate streams to provide greater bandwidth and greater throughput. And also, Ofcom just released a report, I think, within the past 6 months or so, about 4G capabilities. And they said that 4G LTE is 3.3 times more spectral efficient than 3G, and in 2020, it'll expect it to be 5.5 times more spectral efficient. So we just have to look at all these in a much grander scale to see how we can, move forward in addressing it instead of dealing with one isolated issue, because again, it's just, we're going to fall very short.
Richard, can I just very quickly say, with all due respect, I think I actually missed the point, which is that nobody actually knows how that works. There's plenty of incentives in the market to use spectrum efficiently. The question is, how do you reallocate spectrum that's been allocated for certain things? Tom has a very simple answer. You do an overlay license, and you let the market do it. We had concerns about that with the plan. The plan is not about 120 megahertz. The plan is about allowing the market to constantly, not next year, but over decades, constantly reallocate spectrum to its highest and best use by allowing existing providers some incentive to put the spectrum back. And if it turns out that femtocell solved the problem, then the incentive auctions will work totally differently than if it turns out Apple has some other unbelievable machine that causes another 30 times increase. So the fundamental policy question is not what the market incentives are, which will be determined over time, but rather how do you have a mechanism to reallocate the most important asset in this broadband ecosystem?
No, I agree, but one thing I was,
there's a very simple foundation here which we don't have right now, which is we don't have a reallocation mechanism. And I think you're underestimating the importance of that mechanism. You don't need comprehensive reform, you need one sentence reform.
I disagree, because I think what is the incentive to improve receiver standards for entrenched incumbents? There is none. I mean, that's why we're seeing the whole with WCS stars, why we're seeing right now with lights for GPS. I mean, there is no incentive necessary to push forward, market incentive to push forward where they can only spend a nominal amount to improve the filter design of that receiver, which would improve the spectral efficiency of the device and also improve the immunity resistance of it. So,
what you're saying is the FCC should impose new receiver standards. They can do that today, right?
No, not necessarily. Several people I've talked to have said they don't believe the FCC has explicit authority to set receiver standards.
Certainly, if Congress wishes to act to give the FCC authority, I'm happy to say, let's have a two-sentence bill. Here's my problem. And you know this. We have been debating these issues. We've been debating spectrum incentives, inventories a really long time. And it looks like we're going to be debating it another really long time if my political intelligence is correct. It's not that hard. If you just do a couple of small things, we can move the ball and really fall forward instead of trying to do everything, in which case we never do it.
No, you're actually right. I mean, that trying to perfect something is nature of these, and I totally agree with Blair. We can do some small things, and my boss obviously supports incentive auctions because it's included in the Radios Act. But again, we are looking at what other small things can we do to help push this forward, and that's so I think we certainly agree to that extent.
Yeah, so the big picture here is that, in case people weren't really following this last debate, historically the FCC has assigned spectrum for specific applications. But we're now in a place where we understand that mobile networks are to a certain extent a general purpose technology. And so we're moving into we need to move towards a policy realm where all the underpinnings of spectrum allocation, auctioning, resale, secondary use, reallocation support the concept of general purpose technology. So rather than allocating spectrum for a particular application like public safety, for example, that may not be a very well chosen example, but we understand that as an application that can run on a general purpose network. And so all these policy mechanisms have to move in that direction. Okay, so I think it's time for general audience questions now. And people would like I'm not at all surprised that since unlicensed didn't get as much attention as it should, that Mike Bell raises his hand.
Michael Calabrese, New America Foundation. I mean, actually, yeah, I'll include that, although it's probably a follow-up on what Blair said about, you know, the single most important thing right now is to get this incentive auction process. And, you know, the National Broadband Plan, the centerfold was 500 megahertz. You got to keep in mind that only 270 of that was identified to be non-federal, and 3/4 of that is proposed from broadcasting and from mobile satellite. And each of those are running into these major, in a sense, concessions. Matthew mentioned with mobile satellite that, you know, the neighboring band says no interference, no way, no how are you going to do this? We're going to get the Defense Department to stomp you. And then the broadcasters, everything has to be absolutely voluntary for them. So what started as 120 is down to 84 as sort of the high water goal, and it's going to be less than that. And then on top of all that is simply the fact that there's only this finite amount of spectrum that's going to be available to clear and auction on an exclusive basis for the current carrier business model. So, you know, I would just invite Matthew to say in the panel comment on the fact that the Radios Act, Snow Carry Bill, I think at least goes beyond that. It has a incentive auction authority, but it talks also about let's start paving the way for more spectrum band sharing, particularly the federal spectrum, which is incredibly wasted, band sharing and unlicensed. And so it takes this kind of larger, longer-term view, and I wish Matthew could say just a little bit more about what his bill would do for that, and then see if the panel would agree or disagree.
Well, one of the things, you know, certainly, obviously, there is a federal component to this, federal users of spectrum, and that's one of the things we want to do is you know, make sure they're using their spectrum the most efficiently as possible. And what we do is we make some reforms to the CSEA, specifically to the Spectrum Relocation Fund. Certainly, Administrator Larry Strickling has talked about this, about greater flexibility to use those funds for planning and research and for upgrading systems. Because that's one of the things we can see is where we can, you know, upgrade a legacy system by using newer technologies to where they can provide the same service to citizens, but using less spectrum to do it. Or to look at ways to do better sharing, where a federal user might be using spectrum in a regional area that's not mobile, but yet no one else can use the light, you know, can reuse it in other geographical locations. Well, this is a way to explore that through the establishment of very aggressive pilot programs on spectrum sharing and reuse. So we're trying to look at this very holistically, and I know, you know, probably many of you saw the GEO report that recently released, but that was just another one in a series that has certainly highlighted some of the shortcomings that exist with the current spectrum management, at least on the federal side. I mean, there's several reports going back to, I think, early 2002 or so. But one of the key issues is that it's just there aren't the incentives to push greater efficient use of spectrum. And we also call for much more greater planning as well, so that we can have a better understanding of what the spectrum needs are, but then mapping it with the evolutions of technology. And then providing those resources. I mean, you provide them both the carrot and the stick so that they use the resources, but also, you know, that they use it effectively.
Add to that too. I think Matthew was right that there are no current incentives for federal spectrum users and their customers to improve, you know, spectral efficiency. I mean, they'll pay more for it. It's not, you know, there's no direct benefit. They don't keep any of the, you know, lower operating costs or whatever else. So I think that is definitely an important point. But I think that for Senator Warner, one piece of that debate that's missing is that there are some basic government performance questions that aren't really being handled in the current framework. And I think GAO really pointed to some things that a lot of people feel are, you know, frustrating points about interacting with NTIA and managing all these different competing federal agencies. And sometimes it seems like NTIA has a very hard time kind of balancing those demands. I mean, there's the 800-pound gorilla, and there are other users, and those are hugely important functions. I mean, everyone thinks that, you know, military and intelligence capabilities are, you know, priorities that we can't set aside. But there are questions about how effectively and efficiently can we use spectrum to meet those needs. And right now, there's no way to do the things that Matthew is talking about. And I think, you know, certainly there are a number of members in the Senate who support the extension of transition planning and other kind of efficient uses. That can be a substitute for places where you might want clear spectrum, where you still want to, you basically want some kind of neutral arbiter to decide what is the highest use and how you get there. And I think that's one part of the equation that, you know, that's not missing, or that is missing right now, and you know, at least for Senator Warner really feels like that should be part of this conversation, that we should have a little bit more of neutrality in how we look at spectrum use for federal users. Otherwise, you know, the current process kind of limps along, and every few years, the biggest agencies complain about being pushed to release spectrum, and there's this very ad hoc process. So I think there's some really good points in what Mark Matthews is saying about it.
If I might, I want to add something just in terms of the technical realities here. Can you hear me back there?
We're video streaming, so
Oh, okay.
you're not on the mic, you don't
So one of the things that when we looked at deploying broadband wireless networks or cellular operators is that we found that we really need to have wide bandwidth of clean spectrum. So if there is interference, that you can do things like Matthew said, you can add filters to help avoid that. But what that does is it changes the economics of what the wireless operators provide, because you have to do that on the cell towers, but you also have to add filters to the devices, and that turns out to be very costly, especially if you want to sell service at a competitive price. And also, when you look at new technology improvements in wireless, so today we're at 4G, so we've added another G over the past year or so, and in about 3 to 5 years we'll have LTE Advanced, so I don't think we're going to add another G there, but it's going to get better. But to take advantage of those improvements, you need to have wider bandwidth. You need to have sort of 10 megahertz or more. If you only stay within 5 megahertz or less, the operators have really no incentive to swap out their technology, because the spectral improvement is probably in the 30% to 50% range if you really are looking at the worst case kind of deployment of 3G. So it is true that with LTE you have flexibility to use smaller bandwidths, but there really is not a whole lot of benefit to doing that. And many operators, unless there are operators, like for example, like Metro PCS, who did not have 3G, and they did leapfrog to 4G. But mostly in the United States, we have operators who already have 3G. They want to see an improvement in terms of the services they can provide, and they really need to have sort of 10 megahertz or more, in fact 20 megahertz into the future. And this, really, if you look around, very few operators actually have that kind of clean spectrum.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that, but what I'm saying though is what we are seeing with these emerging technologies is that there'll be workarounds. Because also, you know, with LTE, you do both time and frequency division, which provides greater flexibility. You can also do some asymmetric FDD, so where you have a higher, you know, more, instead of a 5 by 5, you can do a 7.5 by 2.5 or something like that, or a 10 by 5, so that you can improve it. So it's just determined also, you know, getting back to your different usage characteristics that we're seeing of this demand. How are consumers actually using this? And also, what are the new protocols? I mean, just for example, MPEG-4, which I know Blair's talked about before. I mean, MPEG-4 is less lossy than MPEG-2, but you can also have a greater compression rate, so that you can use a lower bit rate for the delivery of MPEG-4 versus MPEG-2. So there are a lot of technology, and again, it's just, you know, again, looking at the cohesive nature and looking at all the different evolutions that are occurring to make it more flexible ecosystem.
Any more questions? The audience doesn't have anything. I have some. You were just talking about MPEG-4, so I think one of the things we have to look at, which I find sort of peculiar about this debate, is that up until about a year ago, the primary broadband networks and internet policy debate in D.C. was net neutrality. And the premise behind net neutrality is that the first tool that you should bring to solving any network problem is bandwidth. And that, you know, one of the debates is about traffic engineering. And the people that were in favor of the net neutrality rule said, well, look, if we just have more bandwidth, then traffic engineering is not a problem. Of course, that's a little naive and simplistic. But the scenario, the arguments seem to be reversed when we talk about mobile networks. And so it's the very first thing that we hear from certain sectors in this debate is, well, we need to make the networks more efficient. And that this is, I mean, it's hard for me to make any sense out of this as a technologist, because I, was dealing with one set of arguments for the last 5 years, and now it looks like I have to turn around and deal with the opposite of those arguments, and it's actually the same people who are arguing for greater network efficiency who were arguing for net neutrality for the last 5 years. So if we don't get the bandwidth, if we don't come up with a mechanism for continuous reallocation, the mobile networks don't get the bandwidth, the push for these applications is still going to be there. So I think what we're going to see is things like, the MPEG-4 is just the beginning, DPI boxes inside mobile networks, re-encoding, transcoding video and audio at the mobile edge where the backbone meets the wireless part of it. And it's going to raise a whole host of policy issues about the legitimacy of some of these tweaks, because it turns out that sort of some of the most legitimate ways to deal with video over mobile networks are to do some massaging on the bit stream right before it goes over the radio. And these are all the things that the net neutrality people have been saying. The operator should not touch it. It's all sacrosanct, end-to-end. The network operator should be completely transparent, but they can't be transparent without an awful lot more bandwidth. Anybody have a reaction to that?
I'd just say, even with more bandwidth, the operator is still going to have, well, like AT&T recently did, 3% of the users using 40% of the traffic. How can I incent those users? Video is going to load my network inordinately. How can I smooth my peaks somehow by giving someone a $1 discount until 8 p.m. at night to watch their movie or something like that? These rate plan issues could be very important in relieving that congestion.
Yeah, so there are two separate things I think we need to talk about. So one is capacity, right? So if you start reducing capacity and you can't accommodate everything that everyone wants to do, well, what are you going to do? Either you throw people off, or you, like you just said, you throttle the usage, or in some way shape how they're going to use the network. So adding more bandwidth helps you avoid the problem of essentially having to keep people off or get into sort of the net neutrality, sort of execute on sort of policies that may seem unfair to some people. Now there's also some of these techniques. See, there's the wireless part of the network, but there's also an end-to-end part of the network. And there are certain things, for example, that are being done also in improving user experience by locating information closer to the user. For example, using content delivery networks. It's all separate problems. So still, operators want to be able to improve the quality of service, and they still will do different techniques like monitor what's happening in the network and try to improve the end user experience with particular types of streams. But I think that's sort of a different argument to the one that's really happening here. It's all about how do you provide capacity. So fundamentally, if you reduce capacity, then you've got to figure out what you're going to do to all that demand, and you've essentially got to keep people off. And that's not a good thing.
Well, I would certainly say, I think if you look at the evolution of technology, from ATM to MPLS, and now also with LTE, which I think has 8 or 9 quality of service class identifiers, it just shows you how these standard bodies are looking at how do we improve the optimization of the delivery of different types of traffic over IP, which is best effort. That's what it was fundamentally for. Best effort to get get your information across the internet. And And so these technologies should not be, discarded. They should certainly be embraced because it's the technology like DPI. DPI has been around forever, to be quite honest. For monitoring, networks to determine, any type of usage patterns and also any type of cybersecurity issues at play. So they're not inherently evil. It's just how they're used could be or could not be. And so I think we have to look at these technologies as providing greater resources because with a whole host of different types of traffic that exist. For example, like P2P. That was one of the big issues with the Comcast BitTorrent. At one point, P2P basically was about 50% of the traffic over the internet. Today, it's around maybe 20%. So there's also ebbs and flows of different types of technologies and protocols over the internet. So it's very dynamic in nature. But we do have to look at optimizing because we do have to, streaming video versus, voice. I mean, both obviously have to have, low latency and low jitter, which is delay, and then also the variation of the delay between the packets. So there's just a lot of issues we have to deal with from a technical standpoint that I think, unfortunately, kind of get lost in the debate.
Richard, how are concerned with the network neutrality advocates be if I have a phone that can seamlessly go back and forth between Wi-Fi with a limited capacity and my 4G that's somewhat constrained? And I'm indoors most of the time, at home or at the office. I have access to an access point. Does that option make that less of a concern?
We've kind of had that option for quite some time now, and it didn't seem to play a role, particularly in the debate, or the fact that Wi-Fi has quality service.
The issue also is the question of how traffic is treated. I don't think it's really about usage-based pricing. It's about can you have discriminatory of traffic, right? And there's kind of that fairness question of do you really want that as a consumer? Do you want someone else to make those decisions? There are obviously decisions that have to be made for network management regardless of what you're doing, and there are obviously rules that surround legal content. So I mean, those should be pretty fair. I think there are legitimately questions, I think, for people at Senator Warner are comfortable with the concept of usage-based pricing, not so comfortable with the idea that someone else gets to kind of pick and choose where you speed up, slow down, just based on an arbitrary set of you feel like it. And you know what I mean? There's some set of, I don't know that it has to be regulation or law or whatever, but I think there's a sense of fair play, and that's the motivation I think for people who have an interest in business case of how you make the network actually efficient and work, but also understanding that while companies of course want to differentiate their products, there's also treatment that goes beyond that, and that we don't think that's a great idea.
And to that point, that the type of prioritization or discrimination is not anti-competitive or produces some type of consumer harm. Because at the end of the day, that would be very detrimental to the internet. So.
Well, and net neutrality is not just a good idea, it's the law. Right, in the United States and in Chile, not in the rest of the world. But in these two countries, it's the law.
Some people think the 96 Act is vague on that point.
Yeah, I'm sure we have heard the last part.
Yeah. I'm sure not.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. I wish we had another several hours. But I wanted to just quickly, by way of wrapping up, let's run the panel starting to Tom in this direction. In 15 words or less, what's your message to policymakers of that spectrum?
Sell to Trump. We really do have to focus on a broad liberalization that moves us away from this case-by-case, land war in Asia for each one. And I have some sympathy for what Claire said. I think we're not really going there yet, but we really should move to a much broader liberalization spectrum so we get the right price signals out in the market.
Get the show on the road, and if we delay any more, bad things are going to happen. The quality of the service is going to go down, the calls are going to be dropped, and prices might even reverse and start going higher.
I think having a host of different options to deliver different amounts and types of spectrum is important. Finding the highest use and permitting shared use and some of the things that are innovative and untraditional has proved to be very valuable to our economy in the past. And if we keep a host of options open, we hope that will exist in the future.
Ditto. the one additional thing I would say is that what we're dealing with are incredibly complex issues. And one of the things my boss also, to give another plug for another piece of legislation, is certainly getting greater technical resources at the FCC, because there's certainly been a depletion of engineers there. And these are incredibly complex technical issues that have to be, properly vetted.
Spectrum policy should be better informed by radio engineering and look at how much spectrum can be repurposed if you cellularize the broadcasting.
So hopefully it becomes clear that from a business perspective for wireless service providers, what they need is to have clean spectrum, wide bandwidth of it, and also in good usable frequencies, so under the gigahertz, sub 1 gigahertz kind of spectrum. So I guess my 15-word or less message would be more useful spectrum, and maybe I'll add one more word, please.
Yes.
No, I'm not going to reach the point on that.
Okay. Well, that concludes our broadcast.